Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again back to our third panel on Episcopal leadership and pastoral formation. So our three presenters in this first part of the panel will be Father John Hurley, Diocese of San Diego, Jonathan Lewis from the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., and Archbishop Wilton Gregory, Archdiocese of Atlanta. Any special order, Bishop? Archbishop, want to go first? Or? Please.
When I first encountered Amoris, Laetitia, it took me back to an experience that I lived in Chicago, but since I was based in the Deep South, I was able to bring two realities together. In the first half of the last century, the great migration of African Americans from the Deep South was occurring, taking people from the Deep South to the big cities in the north, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, and a wonderful thing happened. The people who migrated from the South to those large urban areas came into contact with Catholicism. Many of them through our Catholic schools. That's how I came into the faith, through our Catholic schools. And many of you, I hope a number of you will remember either knowing some of the great pioneer priests in those urban areas, working in the Black apostolate, the Negro apostolate as it was then called, who did extraordinary work in the area of evangelization. And many of the people coming from the South put their children in Catholic schools. At that point in time, most people who had kids in Catholic schools were required to go through instruction classes. And it was through those instruction classes that many folks made a personal decision to join the church. Basically, they fell in love with the religion that their children were being schooled and prepared in the Catholic schools, and they wanted to join the church. Here's the problem. Many of those people, not all, but many, had no documentation to be able to seek a canonical trial because they had been married. Some could not prove where they had been baptized because, as you well know, in the South, in the beginning of the last century, Black people literally counted as nothing. Many of them had no birth certificates or certificates that could validate when they were born. If they were baptized, many of the churches or the religious communities in which they were baptized didn't keep sacramental records. And so there was no way to verify that they had been baptized. If they had been married, again, there were no, specific records to attest to the place where they were married or the minister who performed the marriage. And so out of that context, many of them seeking entry into the Catholic Church had to rely on some very crafty, pastorally sensitive, and creative priests. And in those circumstances, many of the marriages that were not able to be adjudicated in a canonical process, many of them were solved in the internal forum. The pastors realized that they could not seek a canonical procedure, but they were dealing with people who were sincere, convinced that they really wanted to belong to the Catholic Church, but were not able to satisfy all of the requirements of a canonical trial. Those priests, and I hope by mentioning this whole moment, those priests did extraordinary work. And many of them brought literally thousands of people into the church. When I read Amoris Laetitia, I said Francis is touching on this same issue, because he realizes in writing this that the situation that many families face today are incapable of being addressed in a canonical way. And so he's asking us, as bishops, as priests, as lay faithful, find a way to address the pastoral situation of the people in today's environment. Now, I shared that with the priest of the Archdiocese, because I said, look, we're in the South. You're too young for most of them, you're too young to remember all of the circumstances that African Americans might have faced in moving from the Deep South to the North, but your predecessors do. And so talk to them about some of the challenges that people faced in the first half of the last century. Many of our young fellows had never heard of the internal form. And I don't criticize them for that. It was just not a part of their formal theological pastoral formation. So we had to begin the conversation. What is the internal form? How do you use it? How do you use it prudently? Now, I know that some of our brothers have used it imprudently as an easy way of avoiding the canonical paperwork and the difficulty of gathering the documentation, and meeting with the people. But a lot of our my younger priests had never even heard of it. So I invited Frank Morrissey, the canonist from Ottawa, the OMI canonist, to come and spend a day with my priest. He had been appointed by Pope Francis to do part of the canonical review that preceded the new canonical norms. So he's a well-respected canonist. I wanted to bring someone in to answer the hard questions and then get on a plane and go home, so that there was some distance, so that the priest could ask him literally anything that they felt would help them better understand what they were facing. Some of you have asked, have I made use of the Processior Brevis? And I have. I have discovered that allowing my three of my canon lawyers, to sit down with me and to go over the cases one by one, I have been able to make what I believe is prudent, with moral certitude, decisions. I have faced about 24 cases, and I've sent 7 back to have the full canonical procedure, but I've approved 17 or 18 of them. What are some of the contemporary struggles? I started out by talking about the pastoral concerns that followed the Great Migration, but what are the contemporary struggles that our families face today? One is certainly the question of permanency. Our millennials, Gen Xers, let's take all of the categories, not that they are all equal, but what do young people understand at this point in our society about permanency? And to be perfectly honest, I have some serious concerns that they have grown up in an environment where everything is disposable. They will stand in long lines outside of stores to trade in a perfectly functioning iPhone to get the latest one, simply because it's the latest one. Almost everything from the time they are in diapers to the point when they go off to college and start their own careers has told them that everything is negotiable and everything is capable of being having a trade-in, an upgrade. I was witnessing a marriage of an alumnus of this venerable institution, and I was at the wedding rehearsal, and we were going over the vows that this young man and his bride-to-be would exchange, and at the end I said, "I will love and honor you to the end of my life, for the rest of my life." His brother, who was in high school, who is going to be the best man the next day, this wonderful family, I love them to death. They are in a solid, both of their parents are married. I know their grandparents. I mean, they don't come from broken families. They've been in Catholic school all of their lives. They know the faith. They practice the faith. When I got to the end of the statement and said, "For as long as I live," the young high school lad said, "Whoa." I mean, it's like he had never heard this before. And I talked to him and I said, "Well, what do you think they were supposed to say?" And he said, "Well, it's so definitive." I said, "Remember that." Remember that. So the issue of family life is certainly influenced by the attitudes that our young people have on permanency. There is the loss of supportive structures that challenge family life today. And I mentioned some of those this morning, but you know many others in your own pastoral experience where mobility, the loss of the extended family living close to you. As we've talked already, and others have mentioned, the typical family, if there is such a thing as a typical family, has a great concern about daycare, which, a generation, 2 generations ago, daycare meant grandma and grandpa, or Aunt Margaret or Uncle Frank. Now, one of the greatest expenses that a young family faces is providing daycare for their children while both of them are employed outside the home. And these factors make family life that much more complex. In addition to that, we have situations where families have to care for the prior generation. So now, in addition to watching over their teenagers, mom or dad needs special attention, maybe coming back to live with them, but maybe living on their own, but living on their own only because their children are keeping a careful eye on them, monitoring their meds, their eating, their physical appearance. All of these, and filial devotion is a great gift. It's a virtue. I was fortunate, even in Atlanta, when my mom and dad in Chicago needed my care, I was fortunate to be able to help them. I consider that one of the great gifts that I could give them in return for all that they had given me. But I wonder what it would have been like had I been a father with kids and a mortgage in Atlanta and trying to negotiate the care of parents living in another part of the country. So those factors influence our family life, and we have to be able to be sensitive to those issues as they confront our people. Amoris Laetitia deals with the real world. When I was here in October and I gave my presentation, one of the things that the priests of Atlanta have told me in so many different ways is that it's an authentic document in that it deals with the real world. It addresses the issues that our people are facing right now, many of them every day. And if we can, as bishops, pastors, theologians, lay ministers, if we can read Amoris Laetitia in the light of the real environment of our people and respond with a sense of understanding and listen to the stories of faith and life, the church will be deeply, deeply blessed. Thank you.
When I met some of the bishops here, they thought I was in San Jose and wondering why I'm speaking on behalf of San Diego. I'm 1 week a month in San Diego, and I'm 3 weeks a month in the Diocese of San Jose as Vicar for Evangelization. But I got a call one time on my cell phone. I knew it was Bishop McElroy calling, and he asked me the question, would you be open to doing a thematic synod? I said, I may. And so we talked about it, and he said, as to his knowledge, there hadn't been a thematic synod before. He'll have something to say on that when we're in Santa Clara. And I think in saying yes, there was no map or blueprint of how to do this. He was also only in San Diego for approximately 2 years when he came up with this idea of convening a synod, not yet knowing what the document would even be called. It had been 43 years in the Diocese of San Diego since the last synod was convened. Most there had no recollection of any of that. But life began to change in the Diocese of San Diego. See, I get confused, and my mailing address is actually San Francisco, so it gets more complicated. But 1 month after the release of the Apostolic Exhortation, Bishop McElroy, after consultation with diocesan leadership and the priest council, sent a pastoral letter entitled, Embracing the Joy of Love, to all members of the local church. In reflecting on that and the needs of the local church, he divided the area into 5 challenges put before all in the diocese. Witness to both the beauty and realism of the Catholic vision of marriage and family life, form a culture of invitation and hospitality to unmarried couples, welcome, nurture, and form children, provide authentic pastoral support for those who are divorced or separated, and bring greater depth to family life. These 5 challenges were the touchstones engaging the synod process. Members of the priest council, 20 pastors, would be ex officio to the synod. 80 other pastors would be asked to nominate a delegate to the bishop for coming to the synod. Bishop didn't know any of those individuals and said yes to all of them. The average age of the delegates was 43. Remembering, we weren't inviting any of these individuals, so we're quite pleased with that number. We didn't have to worry about the difference between men and women because the women had it by 3, 81 to 77. Roughly half of the synod were Latinos. 1/4 were European Americans. And the other quarter were African American and other ethnic groups in the diocese. Delegates chose one of the 5 challenges to work on. Each of the 5 challenge working groups had roughly 30 people in them, with a theologian and facilitators. A great way, we were blessed to have several theological schools within the diocese, or Catholic institutions of higher learning. Each of the groups met for a whole day to come up with proposals responding to their particular challenge. Prior to the Saturday working challenge groups, delegates were invited to have listening sessions on their challenge in their respective parishes. After the 5th challenge working group had met, we had 47 proposals. The last weekend of October, all of the delegates, theologians, facilitators came together for prayer, discernment, and to narrow down the proposals from 47 to 15, 3 for each of the challenge working groups. At the end of the synod, Bishop accepted all 15 proposals, and as a response to his pastoral letter, he just didn't want to go through that again, issuing another pastoral letter. We know where all of the responses were coming from. And within 1 month, 25 of the delegates came together as a Synod Implementation Committee, which is often the more challenging part. We come up with these great plans and not much happens on the implementation. The committee represented the same diversity as the Synod Committee represented the same diversity as the Synod itself. The revisioning of the former Marriage and Family Life Office, which was now vacant due to the retirement of the personnel there, a couple, a deacon and his wife, the title chosen was the Office of Family Life and Spirituality. I think I go back to something Jim was mentioning earlier today to focus on family life and marriage being a component of that, but not having everything seen through that particular lens. It was believed that this would not only embrace marriage, but also welcome the complexities of family life that Archbishop and so many of our presenters have been speaking about today, as articulated in Amoris Laetitia. Newly married couples, one for family spirituality and one for separated and divorce, would make up the new office. 2 task forces were established. One was for engaging young adults into the fullness of life in the church, and the second was to explore best practices in marriage prep. The task force for engaging young adults was primarily made up of young adults. How novel. It was determined that there is a clear distinction between single young adults and young adult couples. And in each of these categories, there are various stages of young adult life. These 2 committees were then later passed on to the Diocesan Young Adult Office. The task force on best practices discerned how best to respond to those who may inquire about being married in the church. It was clear and loud from the Synod that there needed to be a major paradigm shift in marriage preparation, from checking off requirements to a process of engaging life in the church. It was overwhelmingly clear that the first response when one calling a parish should be, "Congratulations on your engagement. We're so happy you called our parish and we look forward to accompanying you to that great day." Rather than, "Are you a registered parishioner?" It was clear that the diocesan day, or the pre-Cana day, needed a major overhaul. It was based on an old model of 5 or 6 one-hour presentations that in this day and age, you're like a deer in headlights looking at it. First of all, many young couples come today and they don't even know what Cana is. Rather than pouring new wine into an old wineskin, the office recreated the day, and it is now known as a day to celebrate your love. The morning is engaging, shorter spirited talks and time for couples to share with one another and with other couples. The afternoon provides an opportunity to select conversation groups which may pique their interest or concerns. Conversation groups are developed on the interest of the participants, such as one for military couples, a big issue in the Diocese of San Diego, ecumenical marriages, communications, interreligious marriages, and others which are led by the couples who can speak to each of those experiences through their own marriage. These conversation groups may vary as they move around the diocese from region to region, and these days are conducted in both English and Spanish. Witness to Love is now the new marriage prep process in the diocese. In reviewing all of the marriage prep programs, all were looked at through the lens of Amoris Laetitia. In mid-February, just a few weeks ago, 2 training workshops were held and over 200 participants gathered, and more than half of that group were young couples. The focus now is on parishes recruiting a coordinating couple to work with and train other mentoring couples. In the Spanish-speaking parishes, mentoring couples are quite common, where padrinos assume this particular role. And it's quite easier in that community. However, this paradigm shift in the English-speaking parishes is very often the couples are not actively engaged in the parish life. In one parish, the pastor every few months invited couples who had been married in his particular parish to come together at the principal Mass on a Sunday and to be introduced to the congregation and to receive the congregation's blessing and welcome. Afterwards, at hospitality, the brides cut a wedding cake for all of those gathered. But as I met with the pilot parish committee, I commended them for the creativity. However, I suggested that the introduction and the blessing may not be the end. Why not invite all these 26 couples to come together and be the newly married couples group? 52 people is a great place to begin. Inventories were also explored, looking at the pros and cons. After careful review, the committee recommended that the diocese go back to focus. Even though the diocese had adopted another inventory program previously, Bishop and I became aware of that the Spanish-speaking parishes never changed to begin with. And we're all doing focus for their preference for cultural reasons. The Synod Implementation Committee invited 10 parishes to serve as pilots. These parishes would explore the Synod proposals and determine how best to respond given their own character and their own profile. Bishop McElroy and I often talked about coming up with one model for all 100 parishes. Instead, the pilots came up, well, it's a funny part that he often shares. He said, with the right-wing blogs that are going on, the Synod was unsuccessful because Bishop was looking for a model and he couldn't find one. Rather than the reality is, each parish has its own model. Instead, the pilots came up with a framework for each parish to use, and the parish would determine appropriate ministerial outreaches. The pilots recommended that they call the parish committee the Family Life and Spirituality Committee to be in sync with the new diocesan office, thus establishing a link. Each committee has a lead contact, not the pastor, because the one thing that Bishop committed himself to at the Synod, that whatever came out of the Synod would not be more work for the pastors, about empowering good lay leaders in the community to be able to assume these roles, that sense of empowerment that we were talking about before in the previous panel. The committee is made up of the coordinators of each of the existing family life outreaches and brings them together where often they would function in silos. So if a parish had an outreach to the widowed and to the divorced and separated, they never talked to one another. Each committee also embraced at least 3 ministries to begin, and the pastor designated the appropriate leaders in consultation for the exploratory committee. Today, there are 30 active committees, and that may not sound alike to some of our eastern dioceses, but 30 parishes is 30% of the Diocese of San Diego. The initial meetings are usually to meet with the pastor and some staff on the leadership to update them on the Synod implementation, recognizing that most of these individuals have heard little or next to nothing with regard to the Synod. I meet with the organizing committee and a member of the diocesan staff, and then the committee moves on in relationship to the Office of Family Life and Spirituality. The Synod Office proposed a parish adaptation to the diocesan office mission statement. Guidelines are provided to the pastors and the framework. And I put before them all of the ministries that are now being done in the parishes, recognizing this complexity of family life. Two major issues for the Synod was ministry to engaged couples and newly married couples, two separate groups. The reason that we liked the Witness to Love program is because the marriage should not be the end point. But then they move into this newly engaged, newly married couple relationship, almost the mystagogia, so to speak, of the RCIA process that we don't often see. The other ministries, just to share those with you and the complexity of family life, was ministry to military couples. Very often, the one that's deployed, a major issue in San Diego, the parent that stays home feels like a single parent and doesn't quite fit into anything else. Ministry to the widowed, ministry to the LGBTQ persons and family members. Ministry to blended families, the realities we experience today. Ministry to single parents, ministry to separated and divorce, ministry to family caregivers, ministry to the civilly married couples, especially in the Spanish-speaking communities. Ministry to ecumenical and interreligious couples, ministry to families with children with mental illness. All ministries are led by people who are identified in the outreach, with the exception of ministry to engaged couples, which is led by a married mentor couple. The aha moment that Jim was asking about before. At the last meeting I had in Oceanside, California, two unrelated high school Latino students, recommended to the committee that they would like to form and start a ministry to children of divorced parents who are caught in the web of their parents' decision and often feel marginalized themselves and torn apart. And it was greatly affirmed by everybody gathered. In all of these groups, they don't need to be managed, but to empower them and let the church know what they need to be successful in that support with one another. A second aha moment for me was the first time I had ever gone out to the eastern part of the diocese, in El Centro, very largely Spanish-speaking community. And the pastor, I was meeting with the committee there, and the pastor shared with me that there's a group of compañeros meeting in the parish for over 25 years. Now, most of us have no idea what that means. The compañeros are parents who have a gay child. And for 25 years, they've been meeting underground, feeling the shame and the stigma. And the beautiful thing that began to happen was to invite two representatives from that group to sit on the parish committee, because they aren't the only ones with a gay child in El Centro. Aha moments for us. Another major focus of the Synod was around conscience formation and the role of internal forum. Like Archbishop was sharing, a lot of our younger priests think it's something new that came about in Amoris Laetitia. Interesting, at a priest convocation recently, when Luke Camelli came to lead them through on this topic, Bishop thanked him, and in a moment came to him, and he looked out at everybody and said, I'd just like to ask this question. How many priests here have ever exercised that internal forum? 3/4 of the priests raised their hands. And the young priests' heads were bobbing around, looking at their mentors who had their hands raised. Thus, the Continuing Education Committee of Clergy continue to sponsor workshops for conscience formation among themselves and for the laity. The Diocesan Office of Catechesis is looking at opportunities to focus on conscience formation in regular diocesan gatherings. My own personal observations have been that Amoris Laetitia and our Synod seem to have responded to a tremendous need in the parishes, and even beyond the parishes, among the people, with individuals or couples feeling marginalized in the church. Pastors tell me that as they issue invitations to lead couples for various ministries, no one has said no. Not one committee has shown any resistance to the mentioning of ministry to LGBT persons and families. If anything, many people have expressed gratitude that it's named and mentioned. Just imagine, in all of these ministries I shared and outreaches, if there's something in the Sunday bulletin mentioning this and inviting people who may be interested in participating in these ministries, what does it say? We're welcome. We all know Pope Francis's image of the field hospital. My personal feeling in San Diego at this point is we keep moving the pegs of the tent farther and farther out. And isn't that fundamentally what Amoris Laetitia is all about? Thank you.
The last shall be first. Hopefully the first shall be last in some way. Well, thank you, archbishops, bishops, and theologians. It's an honor for me to be with you from Washington. I'd like to discuss accompanying adults in parish life, really the praxis of accompaniment, the how question. If we're talking about families, we're talking about teaching, it has to be implemented. We know that moral theology takes root in people's concrete lived experience. And so we ought to talk about what is the reality of that lived experience that we're enculturating that into. That the home of faith for the family is the parish, which Francis calls the family of families. So if there is this paradigm shift that Francis begins in Evangelii Gaudium, continues as we talk about family life in Amoris Laetitia, I think we need to talk about a paradigm shift of the structure of parish life to accommodate that spiritual shift, if that makes sense. That currently our parishes aren't built to respond to the pastoral reality that Francis proposes or to the reality of postmodern Christianity today. Simply because parishes were built in a different century, with a different audience and a different framework in mind. As we look at a postmodern framework, or the work that Brian introduced in terms of the nuns and the reality of millennials, I'd like to propose that an outreach to millennials, those generally aged 20 to 36 right now, would be that generational definition. So we see that coming up, emerging adults, this next generation is new. We know that those millennials make up 25% of the entire US population. This is not a small little blip. This isn't high school youth ministry program of 4 years. It's every fourth person in America. And of those, as Brian shared, 35% identify as none, as a fluid description in and out of dynamic affiliation. Dr. Meg Jay wrote a book called The Defining Decade, a psychologist, and she says 80% of key life choices that are made happened in one's 20s. That one's 20s are the defining decade of a person's entire life, and that we change, our personality changes more in our 20s than in any other decade. So we see this new art or methods and expression, this new evangelization needed for a new sociological reality that's respected in parish life. So in my mind, Amoris Laetitia implements Evangelii Gaudium and orients us toward the Synod on Young People taking place in October. That this forms a pastoral triptych in which we ought to understand each of those in a really helpful way. So I'd like to identify 3 realities, talk about their consequences for marriage and family life, some potential pastoral interventions or implementations, and then specific recommendations within that area. The first is the reality of delayed adulthood. Millennials trying to launch their life during the Great Recession. We know that most people are going to college, some stay for grad school, some are doing long-term service. As a result, they're dealing with massive student loan debt. Some people talk about millennials having challenges with commitment, which is absolutely true. But there would also be this reality of millennials not trusting the possibility of lifelong love. Why? Because they have never seen it. Why should I believe in something that's never been made real to me in my life? And so in some millennials growing up in a generation before where their parents may have been able to graduate from college and buy a house and get married and have kids. We've learned from the panel earlier, that's simply not the reality economically for most young people. When you talk about added child care costs, housing costs in many areas across the country, etc. As Pope Francis says in section 33, today's fast pace of life, stress in the organization of society and labor, all of these are cultural factors that mitigate against permanent decisions. So we recognize that as a starting place within delayed adulthood. So it's no wonder that it takes longer for young people to get on their feet. As a result, the average age of marriage for women is 27. The average age of marriage for men is 29. In Washington, D.C., it's 30. This is 4-year delay just from 1990. So we see this delayed adulthood taking place has doubled just in these last 20, 30 years. There's a new book out called Growing Young from Fuller Theological Seminary in California. And one of the things they identify is that this delayed adulthood both ends later, going towards one's early 30s, but it also starts earlier. When you think about the massive technological connection people have, access to information that starts in your teens, you look at first age of viewing of pornography or access to wild amounts of information starting very early. We see this very long marathon of this period of life that used to be much, much shorter. And so the question is, what's the pastoral response to this new sociological reality where the ending line ends later, but also starts earlier? And our pastoral ministry seems to end as soon as college concludes. So right as people are launching in their 20s, they begin the most important decade of meaning-making in their life and decision-making. All of the support structures that we've built up through confirmation programs, high school youth ministry, college campus ministry is a cliff. And we walk people to the edge of this cliff of the most important decade of their life. When we asked young people about their experience in parish ministry in the Archdiocese of Washington for our synod listening sessions in preparation for the October synod, we asked them, do you have a friend at your church? Like, that's a pretty reasonable question. 50% said no, I don't have a close friend at my church. This audience was not the nuns who answered our survey. A third of the people who answered our survey went to daily mass. The most Catholic people involved in the church in Washington can't identify a friend at their church. The consequences for marriage and family life are obvious. The waiting time has doubled. People are less prepared for marriage without this community of support. As a result, marriage has declined by 64% since 1970, which to a point that was raised earlier, I believe, by Bishop Hebda. So we can't accompany those who we don't know. And yes, we have to have a missionary option, but we have to start with the question of what are we inviting people into? God forbid we go on mission in a radical, productive way. What are we walking people into in the life of our churches? The pastoral implementation is the allocation of resources to adult faith formation and prioritizing young adult ministry as emerging adult formation within the period of parish life. It's been 18 years since the bishops, many of you, proposed the document Our Hearts Are Burning Within Us, that the priority of catechesis be in adult faith formation. Yet I don't know of a parish, certainly not in any of the dioceses I've worked, where there are more resources and staff time allocated to forming adults than there are to forming children. And we're beginning to see some of the pastoral responses to that. We know that children don't make adult disciples. That's not how it works. Adults form children disciples. And our educational pedagogy needs to reflect that. We also know we're in this massive generational shift taking place. The largest generation in history, formerly the boomers, had children, and now that's my generation, the millennials. And so we have this great moment in the life of our church to accompany and to hand off and walk together with these two large generations of life, if we take the moment to have pastoral interventions to make sure that happens. So we've begun to invest more, I think, in the last 20 and 30 years in terms of renewing the vision with high school youth ministry. I think many of us are doing better. I'm sure there's growth there for those who work in that field. I'd say in the last decade or two, I've seen lots of growth in the space of college campus ministry and certain apostolates that have grown up to fill in that space. I think we're on the edge of an investment in young adult ministry, recognizing a decade now of delayed adulthood and need to accompany people practically in parish life. So when we talk about young adult ministry, I want to sort of repropose what might seem common. Young adult ministry is not a singles club for people in their early 20s. It's not youth group with booze. It's not a parallel parish. Instead, young adult ministry is every effort to build community and trust, to accompany people into the heart of a Eucharistic community and form them for missionary life or the personal apostolate in their daily life. Young adult ministry includes RCIA. Young adult ministry is marriage preparation. Young adult ministry is baptism preparation. Young adult ministry includes all the small groupings of various people in different stages of life. It is college campus ministry. It's community college ministry and outreach. It's a cluster of walking with people in all the different iterations and expressions of this decade of life. That right now, if we look around at our parishes, we probably realize we have little to no pastoral response when we're talking about 25% of the entire population of most of our dioceses. We recognize that lifelong communities of adult faith formation ensures that we don't simply accompany people to a cliff, but that we walk them through a threshold of transition in life. If the church is a field hospital, I think we have to be a bit more strategic in our work with adult faith formation to be a continuum of care facility, right? That we have independent living, we have skilled nursing, and we have hospice. I think that analogy works really well in terms of thinking of continuums of care, continuums of pastoral ministry in all of our parishes' lives. That is not currently the reality. I think doing that will stem the 1 in 6 loss ratio that Brian talked about, that 6 people leave for every 1 person returning. The pedagogy that is a key insight for this reality for young people is this principle that belonging leads to behaving, leads to believing. It's probably the most important thing I'll say in my mind. Belonging leads to behaving, leads to believing. We see this in books like Growing an Engaged Church or Forming Intentional Disciples, that you first build trust, that people in that next stage have to begin to try on what faith looks like, how to live this out. And it's only in that moment that our practical catechesis can really take hold. We see this maybe more expressed in a more traditional language of the church, that our lex orandi always informs our lex credendi, right? It's what we do, how we worship, who we are, that informs what we learn and what we articulate as forms of belief. I think the personal process of that goes in the same way.
The veteran note takers missed the last word in your bongo about
belonging, behaving.
believing.
Behaving is the middle one, Archbishop, yes. Belonging, behaving, believing. That's right. And so one of the things we've seen, I think the bishops were right in their early 21st century iteration that catechesis is needed in terms of recatechizing the faithful. I think what was missed are the networks and relationships of belonging in which that formation takes place. We've missed the pedagogy of relationships that is essential for that believing to take hold. We skipped the belonging and the behaving stages in producing textbooks. And so we see now that for postmodern people who live in this need of meaning making, this Sunday-only experience of church life isn't sufficient for those relational ties to take place. It doesn't build friendship, it doesn't facilitate knownness, but it perpetuates anonymity in parish life, which breeds distrust and a lack of commitment. Missionary activity must start within our own parish, and the border we cross, mission is crossing a border, the border we cross is silence. The border we cross is anonymity. It's me walking to a church, not knowing anyone, being able to sit by myself, walk out the door, and no one knowing who I am. There's no incarnational sense in that reality, in that lived experience. So the consequences for family life are decreased opportunities for Christian friendship, for supportive relationships, distrust of lifelong love, and couples simply not knowing how to pray together because they've never seen it lived out. Recommendations include higher expectations and investment in adult faith formation, a preferential option for young adults in our ministry, realigning young adult ministry in diocesan offices with adult faith formation, not with youth ministry, that parishes must identify someone who has the responsibility of this young adult ministry stage and decade of life, or else it's not going to happen. We make sure it happens with development and children's catechesis and sacraments. If we want to prioritize it, we have to make sure there's someone who can make sure it happens. And fifthly, we need to listen to the lived experience of young adults and form leaders in that. The second social reality is broad social disengagement. Robert Putnam's idea of bowling alone, this broad loss of social capital. Archbishop, you had mentioned that a little bit earlier. We see this lived out in a number of different ways in our own parish lives, this broad social disengagement. It used to be, the current structure of parish is built around the idea, people live in the neighborhood, they go to church in the neighborhood, their families stay together, there's maybe cultural or ethnic ties that tie people together. None of those things are there anymore. Like the image of Notre Dame behind us, these buttresses of church life were built around realities that are crumbling and no longer exist. The church isn't falling down if we build new buttresses, if we provide new expressions of support in church life. Within the millennial experience, the Marist Knights of Columbus poll identifies that only 13% of millennials have friends that are in their same religious group. Only 8% of millennial Catholics say they are involved in an organized religious group, which is half of the national average. And that millennial Catholics have the lowest percentage of their friends that talk about matters of faith. So we see that broad social disengagement at play in the millennial Catholic experience. As Pope Francis says in section 43 of Amoris Laetitia, one symptom of the great poverty of contemporary culture is loneliness, arising from the absence of God in a person's life and the fragility of relationships. The family must always be a place, Francis says, where when something good happens to one of its members, they know that others will be there to celebrate it with them. And the family of families, the church and parish life, must be the same. The pastoral implementation here is the reconstruction of parish life to facilitate belonging through small Christian communities, small groups, Christian friendship. This is the model of Jesus, who chose 12 people to walk with him. Parishes can learn from what lay movements and apostolates have discovered in terms of facilitating knownness through smaller clusters of communities, similar to the Pentecostal church comment that was made earlier in the session. Young adult ministries or small group ministries are good adult pedagogy. Adults learn best when they share their faith. It allows us to accompany diverse groups that if we have, as Father John talked about in San Diego, 5 or 6 different iterations of pastoral work, small groupings of that can accommodate it. And they can become a primary vehicle in which adults grow in their faith by building Christian friendship and belonging. Recommendations in this space include parishes discerning in their own way how can they ensure that everyone is known, noticed, and invited to growth. That's going to take different iterations for as many parishes there are in the United States, but that's a key question we have to ask. We have to transform the small groupings or affinity groups that already exist in our parishes to be more intentional. When you think about small groups, there are many that are operative, right? RCIA is a small group. Bible study with the same 10 ladies on Tuesday nights, a small group. Parish staff meetings are small groups. Parish council meetings are small groups. But they aren't necessarily intentional about building Christian friendship and prayer. We can transform the groups that already exist, in addition to welcoming and growing those small group communities that from different apostolates that have grown up, like Alpha, Christ Life, Landings, what Divine Renovation talks about, the Encuentro process, etc. Third recommendation, parishes need to use all touch points of parish life to form these small communities, to offer post-sacramental small group experiences, as Father John said, for long-term mystagogia, to enter into that belonging. Post-RCIA, when we know so many leave the church after they've become just recently initiated. Marriage couples dinner groups, post-baptism family play groups. When new parishioners, that they're initiated into a community of belonging, not just dropped a form of what they can volunteer for. The third reality is relational authority. Most significant change that's taken place since the printing press is the rise of social media. And we see the reality of that in terms of access to information and how we interpret the world. John Packnard, from the author of Church Refugees, talks about this generational shift moving from institutional authority to relational authority. In the 1970s, when you ask people, do you trust banks, the president, Congress, the supermarket, the stores, the places you shop, these institutional areas and sectors of life, people said, yeah, I trust those places. When you ask now, they used to be all above 50% approval. Now all of them, no, I distrust all of them. We've moved from institutional trust to relational trust, institutional authority to relational authority. Now, people don't stop going to banks. People don't stop shopping. But what we found is people have found local and creative expressions for each of these outside of traditional institutions. So instead of necessarily just going to the store to buy everything or to the mall, where do people shop now? Amazon. Instead of just going to the grocery store, people are walking to farmers markets. They want to have that relationship with the person. Instead of buying something from Walmart, people want to go online to Etsy, where they can see the person who handmade their item in Bangladesh or in North Dakota. We've replaced this institutional authority with a relationship, relational authority. And churches need to identify what are the spaces of building relational authority in our daily life. In dating and marriage, it manifests itself this way. No longer do young people say, I want to get married when I find the right person. They now say, if I find the right person, then I'll get married. This echoes Paul VI. Modern man listens more to witnesses than teachers, and teachers if they are witnesses. A contemporary way of saying that might be relative to this idea of relational authority. Contemporary people trust relationships more than institutions, and institutions only if they have relationships. Contemporary people trust relationships more than institutions, and institutions only if they have relationships. People will get married in the church when they have a relationship with a couple who's happily married. People will get married in the church and reconsider that vocation within the context of the sacrament when they have a priest or a leader who walks with them in that journey of finding meaning. This is the path of accompaniment. And the pastoral implementation here is a culture of mentoring that has to take over all of parish life, to transform parish life. It's the model of Paul with Timothy and Titus. It's expressed in our churches right now in the RCIA. We require there to be a mentor. In baptism, we require there's a godparent. But we have to extend that relationship of mentorship to every area of pastoral life. That dialogue, as Francis says, is essential for experiencing, expressing, and fostering love in marriage. It can only be the fruit of a long and demanding apprenticeship. We need apprentice-mentor relationships in order for people who experience broad social disengagement and relational authority to find meaning in parish life. And right now, those structures don't exist. In the preparatory document for the synod, they use the language of persons of reference. Young people need or looking for that person of reference to share in faith. And if we reflect on our own experience, we recognize that each of us has probably had a mentor, someone who's been important in our lives. So the takeaways or recommendations here is that we need to train a generation of adults to be mentors who will bring about the accompaniment of Amoris Laetitia and Evangelii Gaudium that the Holy Father's calling for, that we're calling for. Dioceses need to provide training programs for mentorship, spiritual direction, spiritual companionship programs to facilitate creative models of that accompaniment. Marriage preparation and baptism preparation must incorporate mentorship, like the Witness to Love program that Father John mentioned. Pastors should be encouraged to spend more time mentoring themselves in one-on-one relationships and form leaders who can do the same. And parish leaders themselves, like the parish secretary, need to have solid and meaningful touch points of mentorship. When the way they answer the phone, just like Father John's story, to every positive contact. When we meet with new families in religious education, there should be a one-on-one meeting. That if we do these things, we can restore relational authority in life and implement Amoris Laetitia with an eye towards engaging young people in life of the church. Thank you.